Welcome to the Infuse Compassion podcast, hosted by me, Amy Quisenberry.
And me, Mark Carpenter.
We are on a mission to make this world a kinder place for us all by bringing healthier human connection to communities, families, and organizations of all types and sizes.
Our goal is to create stronger relationships, more inspired teams, increased trust, and improved results.
So let's get started with more ways to infuse compassion into our world.
Greetings, our Compassionators. So glad to have you back with us this week. I hope you got to listen to last week's episode where we talked to Jackie and Cheri about their work around conversations worth having. Fascinating conversation that could have gone on much, much longer. And so Amy and I are excited to follow up on that because this is something that we've seen impact on too. And so I want to start off as part of the conversation that we had last week. Amy mentioned that she was struck by the word fateful, that having these conversations, having conversations worth having is really fateful for us, but we never really defined that word. And so, Amy, I'm going to kick it to you to get to what is the definition of fateful and why did that strike you so strongly as we talk about conversations worth having?
Yeah. The word fateful isn't a word that's used very often, right? And so I just like you said, I went and I looked it up. There's multiple versions depending on where you go. I'm going to choose the one that I want to share. That's the beauty of having your own podcast, right? You get to choose what you want to share. And so it's having great significance or consequences, decisively important, critical. And when I saw fateful, I knew it was a big deal. I knew the essence of the word was fateful, full of fate, right? But here's the piece that's so fantastically awesome about what they talk about in their book, Conversations Worth Having, and what they shared in the episode. By the way, like we always say, if you haven't listened to it, please go back and listen to it. You don't have to be at the mercy of your circumstances. You don't have to be at the mercy of your circumstances. So when we talk about fateful, you have the ability to change what happens next just by the conversation that you're having and how you choose to have that conversation, how you show up in that conversation.
And to me, that's the key, is the intentionality behind it. That we're aware that these conversations really are worth having. They really do matter. They really are of consequence. I want to get those words right. Momentous significance or consequence. I loved that phrase, that they do matter. But if we aren't conscious of that, we're going to have the conversation and may miss an opportunity. And then it's fateful in the opposite direction. It can potentially take us to the negative path rather than the positive path if we're intentional about it. And so you brought this up, so I'm just going to follow down this path a little bit farther. And that point about not being at the mercy of our situations, it's actually really empowering to me to look at these conversations and go, I can do something about it with the right skills and with the right kind of framing in our minds about the conversation. I can actually do something that takes a situation that I might look at otherwise and say, there's nothing I can do, and actually have a positive impact for myself and for other people. And from a business standpoint, from a leadership standpoint, particularly, it's so important that we remember that if we have the conversation around an issue, it doesn't have to be there's nothing I can do about it. There's always something you can do.
Yeah.
And so asking that question of what could I do here? How could I reframe this conversation so that it does have a more positive outcome? And so I know that struck you. You were the one that brought it up about not being at the mercy of the situation. So I'd like your perspective on that as well.
Yeah, it's really, for those who know the story of how Start with Compassion, the framework that I created, came to me. I was in this really dark place, right? I was in this really dark place. And one of the things that I learned in creating the framework and in working the framework is a lot of times you feel like your options are limited. You feel you can't do this, you can't do that. I can't do this, I can't do. And I learned to stop and say, but what can I do? But what can we do? And even reframing. So we talked about a lot here. We're talking about it. Reframing when somebody is coming at me with, well, we can't do that. Okay. But what can we do? What's one thing that we can do? Let's just start there. And it's such a beautiful place of, if we allow, take a breath, like they shared, Cheri and Jackie, pause, take a breath, and get curious. But what can we do?
Yeah.
And then what comes in to our minds? But what about you, Mark? What does this
just
bring
what you're
up?
saying, it opens up your mind. There is physiological connection to the psychology of what's going on inside your brain. Before I go down that path, I just remembered a story that relates to what you're talking about. My son probably won't even remember this. It was when he was in high school, and his midterm report card had a D or a D plus on it in one of his subjects. And I asked him about it, and he said, well, I was sick a couple of weeks ago, and I missed the midterm. And I said, okay, so what are you going to do to bring that grade back up by the end of the semester? He said, well, the teacher won't let me make up the test, so there's nothing I can do. And I said, well, but there's got to be something you can do. What else could you do to bring that up? And honestly, I was just looking for him to say, I'm going to have to do really well. I'm going to have to work really hard on my projects, that you're just going to have to be dedicated to it. But he was locked into, there's nothing I can do. There's nothing I can do. And so I stopped and said, if there was something, if there was anything you could possibly do to bring that grade back up, what would it be? And he paused for a second, and he took a breath, and he said, well, I think that some of the other students have asked that teacher for extra credit assignments, and he's given some of those. So maybe I could ask for an extra credit assignment. Now, this is where it was not my best dad moment, because at that moment I said to him, so there is something you can do. And then he was like, thanks, Dad, because you get off my game. But he did it. He went and he got the extra credit. If we take that pause, and I really think the breath is part of it, to take that pause and just ask ourselves, what are the possibilities? What could I do? If I could open myself up, what would there be that would happen? And I love the connection to the brain science of just reconnecting, because when we get into that, there's nothing I can do mode, it triggers our fight and flight response. It triggers the amygdala. And so it pulls resources in our brain away from the higher reasoning centers of our brain. And we don't make good decisions in those moments. And you've probably seen that. In fact, I frame it this way with people a lot of times. Do you ever have a conversation that doesn't go well? And then about 20 minutes after the conversation, then you can think of everything you should have said. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's because your brain's not working on full function.
Well, and that, we talked about it outside of the break. The conscious leadership group talks about, along with Jackie and Cheri, going below the line. That's what you're talking about, right? We're going below the line. But then taking that pause, taking the breath. So I'd like for you, Mark, to go a little bit deeper, because I know on the break you got really passionate about this, right? Like dig into it. Talk about what's happening in the brain. I think it's good for, I think, there's a lot of people who know about this, but I think there are also a lot of people who are familiar with it or maybe haven't. And so,
well, I'm not smart enough to be a
bit.
neuroscientist, but I love reading from people who are and who can explain it in a way that I can relate to, because I think we all experience it. That we we are a little bit wired, and we're wired by our experiences, and I think some by evolution, to look for ways to protect ourselves. And we're constantly scanning the horizon looking for threats. Well, if we're looking for threats, we're going to turn things into threats that may not be a threat. The way I always think about it is, if you're out walking in the woods and you hear a rustling in the forest, well, you can assume that it's a predator and that you should protect yourself. Or you could assume that it's no big deal and just keep walking. Well, if it's not a predator and I assume that it is, I'm still safe. But if it is a predator and I assume that it's not, then I'm dead. And so that I get wired to look for the threats and react in ways that are threatening. But we take that with us into our business environments, where most of the things are not a threat, but we turn them into a threat. When we go into that threat mode, our brain starts shutting down in the reasoning centers that we need to help us consider, what else could I do here? What else could get me out of that? Mm-hmm. Now, the other great brain science behind that is the power of questions. You brought that up earlier, Amy, about asking, what could I do? What are the possibilities here? And the simple act of asking ourselves questions forces energy back to the more reasoning portions of our brain, because the human brain wants to answer questions. If I throw out a question to you and to our listeners here, I'm going to put this one out there. What is the most predominant color of clothing in your closet? All of a sudden, your brain wants to answer that. Your brain immediately starts picturing your closet. It's going to be hard for you not to think about that until you have an answer to it. Like, your brain's probably spinning on that right now, isn't it, Amy?
I know exactly what it is, because I color code my closet.
But you immediately pictured that closet and you had an answer. Now, if people haven't color coded their closets as well as you, they may start fiddling on that and be thinking about that question until they go to their closet and look. But questions will cause our brains to work. And so there's so much power in that, to bring ourselves above the line, as we talked about, to get out of the depreciative conversations and into more appreciative conversations, where we're not in judgment mode, where, as you like to say, we're silencing the judger, and getting ourselves above the line to where we're curious rather than furious. And that's a phrase that I use a lot, is, ask yourself questions to the point where you can be curious rather than furious. And that brings us to a point where we can be better leaders, where we can be better family members, where we can be better citizens, if we're thinking more in terms of what are the possibilities rather than there's nothing I can do.
Yeah. It's so absolutely powerful. They talked about one of the things that they said that really struck me was how all of these I've never thought about it this way. All of the conversations that we're having throughout the day, and even the conversations that we're having with ourselves. And I've thought about this before, right? I've thought about it from the perspective of, Amy, what you say to yourself matters, right? What you say to yourself matters. I've not always, but there was a time in my life where I was taught that, I don't know, somewhere in my 30s. And I thought, wow, it really matters how I talk to myself, right? But the way that they phrased it, it was so powerful in helping us get to be our best. How we are talking to ourselves, how are we interacting with other people, and then paying attention when we are at our best, what's happening. When we are at our best, what's happening when we're at our best, to get, again, intentional and really paying attention. Hold on, things are really working for me right now. I just had a fantastic meeting. Great. What happened? What did you do? What happened did you do something before the meeting that maybe got you there? Was there something that somebody else did in the meeting? what happened and really look at what's happening that helped you show up at your best. So powerful.
Yeah, and
right?
a lot of times it's most important to look at that internal perspective around that too. I think sometimes I walk away from meetings and go, "Oh, well, that was a great meeting because everybody else was cooperative." But now I'm putting it onto other people, and I can't control that. And so it's getting back to, how did I come into that meeting that made it better? Because if I can understand that, then I can
Yeah.
get back to that state. And when we take that pause and breathe, when we find ourselves slipping below the line, that's what we want to call back. We want to call back, all right, when I've been above the line, what have I done that's different than what I'm doing right now? In terms of my thought processes, in terms of the word choices that I'm using, in terms of the way that I'm asking questions, maybe even in terms of the body language that I'm bringing into that meeting, because that makes a difference in how I'm presenting, and if I'm presenting below the line or above the line.
Well, and this takes me to the throwaway comment, right? Where Jackie and Cheri, I can't remember, I think it may have been Cheri that spoke about it, the throwaway comment, the person who just says something and they weren't really thinking, but it struck this other person. It hurt them, caused feelings, emotions, whatever, brought them below the line for a moment, maybe longer. And when I go back to how are we as leaders going into, as you're saying, meetings, what are you saying? How, when you ask your, because we can get curious, right? But we can be below the line when we get curious, right? We can get, so let's get really clear. There's a way to get curious that is in an appreciative way and not a depreciative way. And it's really, what do you want out of this meeting? What's your intention? What do you want to accomplish? And then how are you showing up that's going to help you, as you're saying, Mark, how you're showing up, walking into the meeting, bringing into the meeting your attitude, what you're saying, how you're saying it, being accountable. Because there are people in my orbit, and I'm sure I do it as well, and I need to work on it, I'm sure. There's a snarkiness that I can sometimes show up as, where a throwaway comment can come out, right? So I'm holding myself accountable right here, right now, right? Because I started to talk about other people in my life, and I'm like, well, Amy, let's talk about you first. You first, Amy, right? But that, wait a second, we can do better, right? And to really get intentional on how helpful was that comment when you think about what you're really trying to accomplish here. And then we can always go back and say, you know what? I'm sorry. I totally went below the line. I loved what they said, and I'm sorry I'm going to bring you in this, but Jackie shared, ask for a do-over. Ask for a do-over conversation. I love
and
that.
People feel reluctant to do that because it feels like I'm admitting a weakness. Well, guess what? Admitting you're a weakness, admitting you made a mistake makes you human, and it actually makes you more strong.
Yeah.
And it actually is perceived more as a strength than as a weakness, that you're willing to step up to that. And you use that word intent or intentional. And the root of that word can go a couple of different directions. Being intentional about it, being deliberate about it, but also what is your intent? What is your motive or your purpose in that conversation? And that makes a difference too, because that can make the difference between below the line and above the line. If my intent is to make myself look better, or to get my point across, or to make sure that the other person knows that I don't like their idea, that's all below the line. But if my intent really is curiosity, that I want the best for everybody, then I'm going to be above the line. And it comes out in how we say and the comments and how we ask the questions.
So speaking of asking questions, you do this with me a lot. So I'm going to do it with you because it's fun. It's good, right? When you think about Mark, when you think about somebody that maybe showed up in a way that they realize I it wasn't my best. And they come and they say, Mark, I'm sorry. Mark, I'm sorry. Mark, I made a mistake. Mark, I should have done better. Whatever it is, right? How do you feel about that person in that
Oh, my
moment that they're
respect for
saying
them goes up incrementally
that? That's
because I
instant,
realize
right?
that they have the confidence, their own emotional maturity and
Mm,
emotional strength that they can own their part of it. And without diminishing themselves and without saying, I'm going to fall on my sword here, to use a phrase, and make this all my fault, but to say, you know what? I got off track by doing this. I got to own that part of it. And owning the
yeah.
part,
Yeah.
kind of asking yourself, what is my part of this that I can own? That is actually very powerful in driving good intent as well, into making sure that we do show up as the best version, the above line version of ourselves in those conversations.
Mm, I love that. What else? What else, Mark, did you what are some of the other things that just really struck you?
I'll go back to something you touched on briefly here, but one of the questions that I didn't get to ask to Jackie and Cheri was, is every conversation a conversation worth having? And they kind of answered it without me
Mm,
asking that question, because I think a lot of times we look at the effort that's required. That intentionality requires effort. It requires us to be thoughtful in what we're saying, to think about what we're saying, and have these conversations. And I think their answer to that is yes, every conversation is a conversation worth having, or can be, if we bring our best intent
yeah.
into that conversation. Because even if it's, we're talking about a football game that was last night, or our kids' activities, or the vacation that we were on, the topic of the conversation may not seem that consequential, but the relationship in the conversation probably is. And that's what makes it a conversation worth having, is that it can strengthen that relationship going forward for the times when maybe the topics are a little more difficult. Sometimes in leadership positions, leaders will say, I got to separate work and home. I can't have any conversations about what they did over the weekend or their family or anything else. But consistently, people who talk about their great leaders say they know me as a person. They know what's going on in my life.
Mhm.
And that matters. And that makes those conversations worth having.
Well, and this is the essence of Fateful right here. What you're talking about right now is when we don't put the intentionality into our conversations, we are accidentally negligent. We don't really pay attention to the words that are coming out of our mouth and don't realize the potential impact, right? This is where the disastrous, that some of those definitions we're talking about, the disastrous consequences, right? That this is the essence of Faithful. So that's why, yes, I agree. Every conversation is a conversation worth having, which also means sometimes we may choose to not have a conversation,
Or not have it in that
right?
moment.
I'm just
Uh,
going to,
You know, to get to a
right.
moment where it's easier for me to be above the line.
Well, and, and even there was a time in my life where I was very uncomfortable with silence, right? And if there was silence, then I was going to start talking, right? And then I realized, Amy, you don't always have to say something. Like you don't have to fill the void. You're not here to entertain. Like, not that you're entertaining, right? Let's be clear about that. But like it there are times that we can choose to not say anything because maybe it's you don't have anything, you don't have anything at that moment to add to the conversation, then just listen. You can just
Yeah.
listen to the other person. That's a
And that's
possibility
okay.
as well,
I, I,
right?
I love the
And
phrase
that's
that you
okay.
used just a little bit ago about accidentally negligent. And I wanted to bring
Mm,
that back out because I want our compassionators to know that nothing in what we're saying is saying you have to be perfect in every conversation that you have, because I think that's an unrealistic
mm.
expectation. It's certainly not an expectation I want to try to live up to. And it's just being aware and owning it when we make mistakes and recovering and learning from that, and just getting ourselves in a higher percentage of the time where we're above the line rather than below the line in these conversations.
Well, and the power to turn around when we do show up as accidentally negligent, we show up in a way that we're not pleased or proud of ourselves, to be able to turn around and just say, you know what, I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You deserve better. The other day, it's been a while, but a couple months ago, I yelled at Freddie about something, and uh, Freddie's my husband. And I instantly turned around and I said, I'm sorry. You didn't deserve that. You deserved better. I'm sorry. Because that was all me. That was my crap that I threw onto him.
And
Accidentally
that,
negligent.
I'm sorry,
Accidentally
I started to
negligent.
interrupt there. It goes back to what you were saying
That's okay.
earlier, too, that those are the moments that we need to learn from. When you say, okay, why did I do
Yeah.
that? If that's not what I want to be, if that's not who I am, why did that happen in that moment? And it could be just an awareness of
Yeah.
I was tired, I was stressed, I was hungry. Maybe there were all these situations that were leading to that. And I'm not making those as excuses, but to just be aware that when I've got these other situations where maybe I'm physically not at my best, I need to be more conscious. I need to be more intentional about how I behave so that I don't slip into that accidental negligence.
And this is going back to the mercy. We don't have to be at
Yeah.
the mercy of our circumstances. We have the ability to choose and do different, right? We have that ability. What
Boy,
else,
that,
Mark?
yeah.
There's so much. There's so much that we dug into. Is there anything else that you want
I
to
think my
talk
parting
about?
thought would be investigate this a little bit more. If this is striking a chord with you as listeners, go get the book, Conversations Worth Having. Get onto their website. We've got it in the show notes, and make sure that you dig into that a little bit. And they were generous. Jackie and Cheri were generous enough to give a discount to our compassionators for their preliminary course, their foundational course, which is a 30-minute online self-paced course that you can do. Take advantage of their generosity and learn more about this, because there's we can't sit here and talk about it and really have it sink into you in the way that you can if you're digging into it yourself and learning and how it applies in your life, because it's going to apply to each of us in a little bit different way. So learn more. We can all do a little
Mm-hmm.
bit better. I know I can. And this has been helpful for me to get more intentional. So how about you, Amy? What are your final thoughts on this?
You know, I was really struck when we talked about the barriers to showing up, and Jackie said, "We are the
Yeah.
biggest barrier, right? We are the biggest barrier." And that goes back to what you were just talking about, Mark. You know, we can sit and talk about things all day long, but it's getting experiential. It's doing it. It's trying it on, seeing what fits. It's going back, reflecting. You know, we've been talking about journaling for, I mean, decades. We've been talking about the power of journaling. And that's a great way to just reflect. And, you know, with the beauty of technology, you know, we can journal in our phones. You know, we don't have to have the book in front of us, but just to really, there's this phrase that keeps on coming out for me lately, and it's be at home, Amy. And this is
Yeah.
home. Be at home. Be at home and really feel and be present and understand what's going on in here. And then what are we going to do about it?
And I think for home for everybody
So,
is above the line. It's in that appreciative mode. I don't think it's a natural state for anybody to be in a depreciative mode. And so I like that point of let me be home. Let me be where I know that I want to be. And let's just all work at being a little bit better every day.
That's right. I love it. All right. Thank you, everybody, for showing up. We really appreciate it. Like, share, and you know what? If you have a conversation worth having that you want to come and share with us, reach out to Mark, reach out to me, email us at infusecompassionpodcast.com. Let us know. That's actually how we heard about Jackie and Cheri. Is a friend of a friend of a friend told them about us, and they reached out. So definitely reach out. You just may have something that is really about infusing compassion in the world, and we want to share it with the world. So don't be shy.
Have a great week.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you for joining us for this episode of the Infuse Compassion Podcast. If you enjoyed the conversation, please share a review and like the podcast so other compassionators can join us. Until next time, let's all do something each day to infuse compassion into the world. For more information on our guests, see the show notes. For more information on Mark and Amy, go to infusecompassion.com.